Welcome to our Wharton webinar series. My name is Robin Turner, and I'm the Associate Director of Lifelong Learning and Alumni Relations. Today's webinar is part 2 in our ESG series, discussing new research in environmental economics and green policies. We welcome our host and moderator, Professor Sarah Light, Mitchell J. Blutt, and Margot Crody-Blutt, Presidential Professor, Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics, and Faculty Co-Director of Wharton's Climate Center. Joining Professor Light today is Professor Susanna Berkouwer, Assistant Professor of Business Economics and Public Policy, and Professor Mirko Heinle, Professor of Accounting. Today's webinar will begin with an update on the Wharton ESG initiative from Sarah, then brief presentations from Susanna and Mirko, followed by a moderated discussion and Q&A. You are welcome and encouraged to submit questions at any time. The Q&A button can be found on the top right side of the screen. If you don't see the Q&A button, please exit full screen mode. After the brief presentations and discussion, they will be taking questions from the audience. For specific questions, please indicate to whom your question is directed. And finally, for closed captioning, simply click on the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Now, please join me in welcoming Sarah, Susanna, and Mirko.
Hello, welcome to today's webinar. I'm delighted to be hosting for this event, and I'd like to thank Robin for that lovely introduction. I'm here to welcome all of you on behalf of Wharton's ESG initiative, which brings together Wharton faculty and students to conduct academically rigorous research, develop new curricular materials, and co-curricular experiences here at Wharton that shape the future of investing, consulting, and strategy, as well as policy on ESG-related issues. The ESG initiative here at Wharton is kind of the umbrella organization, and it houses multiple centers and labs, including Wharton's Climate Center, of which I am one of the co-directors, as well as the Impact Investing Research Lab and the Zicklin Center for Business Ethics and Governance, among others. The ESG initiative and the Wharton Climate Center have more than a dozen affiliated faculty members, as well as numerous student affiliates. We run student co-curricular activities, including an impact investing challenge and student-led ESG-related consulting projects. If you are interested to learn more about the ESG initiative, we will provide a link to all of you after the conclusion of the webinar, where you can sign up to learn more about upcoming events, as well as opportunities for alumni interaction. Shifting to today, you are going to hear from two lovely Wharton faculty members who will be presenting their research. Our first speaker will be Susanna Berkouwer, who is an assistant professor in the Business Economics and Public Policy Department, and whose research focuses on development economics and environmental economics, and who uses experimental and non-experimental applied econometrics methods to study energy efficiency adoption, electricity grids, and air pollution from energy usage. Our second speaker will be Mirko Heinle, a professor of accounting, whose research focuses on accounting disclosure in capital markets, the regulatory process of such disclosure, and internal capital allocation. So it is my pleasure now to turn it over to Susanna Berkouwer for their presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. I wanted to talk about international CO2 offsets. So when we talk about businesses that want to reduce their carbon footprint, there's usually two options for them to do so. Either they can reduce their own emissions within their supply chain or within their company, or they can buy carbon offsets, right? Either of these they can use to achieve net zero targets. But carbon offsets have seen a lot of criticism. You may have seen headlines by Bloomberg that carbon offsets were fake, that there was fraudulent practices, especially in deforestation. You hear this a lot. And so as a result, the SBTi corporate net zero standard had says that companies are no longer allowed to use offsets to meeting their net zero targets. And so instead, what companies will do is invest in their own operations. So I want to start with a simple example. This could be a household as well. Suppose that you're or a firm or a household considering buying a new vehicle, and you have a choice between buying either an electric vehicle or a gasoline vehicle, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act, as an example, has dedicated billions of dollars towards electric vehicle credits. And so we can think about the changes that happen in this transition. So you can look at EPA data, how many miles do cars usually drive, how much do they emit? They emit about 4 tons of CO2 when you factor in all of the gasoline that they use. And so if you replace this with an electric vehicle, in the best case scenario, right, if the grid was totally clean, fully powered by solar or wind, an improved electric vehicle should emit about 0 tons of CO2. All right, so we can think about the cost effectiveness of this. How much more does an electric vehicle cost? Maybe let's say it costs about $10,000 extra. And so you can think about how much value do you get from these subsidies that the IRA has given. So some of those subsidies are going to go to people who would have bought an electric vehicle anyway, right? So when you factor in those types of effects and you think, okay, $10,000 extra for going from 4 to 0 tons of CO2, what is the total cost here? Well, research has shown that this is about $1,300 per ton of CO2 that you abate. That's the estimate for this particular program. So I want to think, are there more effective ways that we can reduce CO2 emissions? I'm going to talk about my own research on improved cook stoves. So we did a project in Nairobi with 1,000 residents in low-income areas. All of them use this traditional, what is called a Jiko stove. It uses charcoal. People spend a lot of money, 10 or 20% of their incomes buying charcoal every day. And so we gave them the opportunity to buy an improved stove. And they look very, very similar. They both use charcoal. The new one is just much more efficient, better heating insulation, better manufacturing. And so we wanted to know whether this would reduce the amount of charcoal that people use. And so this is a graph showing how much people say they spend on charcoal every week. And we had SMS data that would go every 3 days. People would get an SMS. How much did you spend in the past 3 days? And so we can convert that to weekly spending. And so you can see here that before the study, people were spending on average about $1 a day, $7 a week. And then immediately after, just days after, the people who adopted the improved stove saw a significant reduction in how much charcoal they were buying, right? And therefore how much charcoal that they were using. And so this is an aggregate measure for those who are really in the weeds. If you're worried about stacking or rebound, that's all accounted for here. And we didn't just have this one survey. We had 7 different surveys with self-reported phone surveys, in-person surveys. We had purple air monitors measuring 2.5 pollution. And then we also weighed the ash that was being generated from burning charcoal in all of the households. And across all of these measures, we see a reduction of about 40%, even 3.5 years after the study. And so that's about $120 in fuel savings. So these are hugely important for low-income families. It's about a month of income that they're getting. And the stove price is only $40, right? Huge IRR. And when you think about the kilograms of charcoal, how much deforestation does that stop? That means that adopting a stove reduces about 1.8 tons of CO2 per year. Right, so that's kind of the comparison that we want to make here. Why can't low-income households adopt this, given that the savings are so high? Well, what we found is that giving access to a loan doubles their willingness to pay. So we actually were able to elicit a demand curve. So this is, if you've taken Econ 101, this is just the standard downward sloping demand curve. This is what people told us in kind of an auction game. And you see that demand is more than twice as high for people that had access to a loan. So that's really the issue here, is people don't have access to credit. But of course, administering credit is really expensive. You need to track payments, follow up. You can't have recourse to default. There's no collateral, things like that. So really the more realistic option, the policy option, is really just to subsidize the price of the stove. And so what we can do with that demand curve is we can see how many people would have bought the stove anyway, right? Just like with the EVs, when you give a subsidy to someone who would have done the thing anyway, we call that an inframarginal subsidy. It doesn't actually change anything. You still have to pay all of that money. And we can also look at the marginal people. So who actually changed their decision as a result of the subsidy. So we can factor in all of that money and think, how much more adoption of stoves do you cause when you spend money on these subsidies? And so we find that spending $100 on subsidies increases ownership by about 3.5 stoves, and each of them are owned for about 2 years. So it's about 7 years of stove ownership. And then based on what I showed you on the previous slide, each year of stove ownership reduces about 1.8 tons of CO2. And so when you combine these two estimates, we estimate here that reducing a ton of CO2 by offering cook stove subsidies costs about $7.75. And remember from what I showed you earlier, for an electric vehicle, it was about $1,356. Right? So those are the numbers that we're comparing. Now, something may go off in the back of your head if you've been watching the news. Our cook stove offset's terrible. There have been hugely controversial cases of fraud in the cook stove industry. Academic research has shown this as well. I think the thing to highlight here is there are just tons of different types of cook stove projects, right? Some are going to be really high quality, some are going to be really low quality. Why is that? Management practices, innovation, quality of procedures, quality checking, all of these other things that make some companies successful, some companies less successful. But the key is, can we identify the really high quality projects? And we're going to need independent evaluation and verification to identify those projects. And Mirko's going to talk more about that verification part of it as well. But I just want to come back to that cost effectiveness comparison. So about $10 billion have been spent on carbon offsets in the past several years. And so if you think about, should we spend those $10 billion on companies doing their own emission reductions? For example, Amazon buying electric vehicle delivery vehicles, or should they spend it on offsets? Well, I did the calculations for you that I showed you just now. And so we find that because the stove is so much cheaper, right? It only costs $30 more. You can actually get these much more cost-effective emissions reductions. Sorry, this slide is a little bit messed up. Let me just skip to the punchline here, which is that for every $1 million that you spend, right, an improved charcoal stove will reduce about 100,000 tons of CO2. Whereas if you spend that money on something like electric vehicles, you're only going to reduce 740 tons of CO2. And actually, there's this kind of Buy America Act, which kind of limits production to American electric vehicles. That adds additional costs. So under that rule, $1 million of spending will reduce about 300 tons of CO2. So again, much smaller amounts than what you would get from subsidizing approved stoves. So where do we go from here? Right. So I mentioned verification, the importance of verification. I want to propose something that basically this is what the UN has been trying to create for decades, right? Something like a Kyoto Protocol or an Article 6.4, which is something like an FDA, where when you go to a CVS or a Walgreens, you can't just buy any old drug, right? You have to only buy drugs that were approved by the FDA. And so we ideally want something similar for offsets, where you can only buy offsets that have been shown to work. So what does that mean? Approval requires rigorous independent evaluation, right? For the FDA, they're doing randomized trials, control groups and treatment groups. So they want to compare outcomes for people taking the medication and people don't. Similarly, we can do that for offsets. When you offer offsets versus when you don't, what is the emission reduction? And therefore, how much do you actually achieve in terms of these reductions? You want to have full disclosure on what I'm going to call side effects, right? You have that for medications. We want to know the exact same thing for offsets. Are there anti-poverty benefits? Is there local air quality benefits? We want to rigorously measure and quantify all of these. And so once you've certified that, these offsets or these drugs are actually what they say on the tin, then the buyer can just simply choose the cheapest ones, knowing that what they're buying is a high quality product. Of course, implementing that type of FDA is really expensive and really complicated. It's still going to be worth it just because of the big cost difference that we see between these products, right? You could have a lot more spending on monitoring and evaluation, and it will still be a lot cheaper to reduce CO2 through offsets than it would be to do that through own companies' emissions reductions. Right. And so there's been, I mentioned, a number of different initiatives trying to create this type of organization, starting with the Kyoto Protocol and the Clean Development Mechanism. There we saw really insufficient scrutiny of additionality. So as I mentioned earlier, are the subsidies going to people who would have done the thing anyway, or companies that would have invested in a certain clean appliance anyway, or are they actually creating change? More recently, Gold Standard and Verra have certified in the voluntary carbon offset market really requiring these kind of self-reported data sets, but of course, there's widespread concerns there about accuracy. And so you really need an independent body that doesn't have any incentive to increase the numbers, to really dedicate to evaluating various processes. And so most recently in the Paris Agreement, and then this year as well in Baku, we saw Article 6.4. The rules for this are currently being written, but it has all of these questions, right? How do you verify additionality? How many of the subsidies are going to people who are not actually changing their behavior at all? How can we measure impact? How much CO2 is reduced? Who is certified to conduct verification and measurement, right? You want this to be independent governments, bodies who will, report truthful findings, and then which projects are allowed to sell offsets in the market. There's many unanswered questions here, but I'm looking forward to tracking what happens with Article 6.4. If the quality of verification and measurement can improve, then offsets provide a real way for us to increase the CO2 reduction that we achieve with the abatement investment that we offer. So we want to develop cheaper climate solutions. We want to maximize our impact by funding the most effective abatement technologies. And if needed, we want to invest in costly quality standards to make sure that what we think are effective technologies are actually achieving the reductions that we want. So I'll end it there, and I'll hand it over to Mirko now. Thanks for your time.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm going to pick up basically on Susanna's last couple of questions, and I'm going to do that at the very end of my slide deck. And just to foreshadow, I'm going to say if we ever have something like a climate FDA, it will go wrong. There will be scandals, and that's going to be okay, because that's just sort of what is normal. All right, so I'm going to focus a little bit on the corporate side as well as the accounting side of all of this. So let's start sort of really, really big picture with the problem of public goods, and that's effectively sort of where Susanna was talking about. If we think about economic theory, there's two really reasonable solutions to tackle climate change or tackle the overuse of public goods, which is taxation and quantity control. Taxation works, it's really efficient, it's really simple, but we just really hate taxes. If I want to say this in different words, we really, really, really hate taxes, right? It just doesn't, it's sort of something that works really well, but it's just not implementable. Quantity control on the flip side, or especially direct quantity control, is really hard. Telling everybody what they get to do, what they have to do, requires an incredible amount of knowledge, and people don't like being told what to do either. So what can we do? We can do sort of a mixture. Something like a cap and trade. A cap and trade basically says we make a quantity decision at the country level, and then we require firms, companies to provide certificates when they provide emissions, when they emit greenhouse gases, and then we sort of make those certificates available. And then a firm can either reduce emissions and sell some leftover certificates, or it cannot reduce emissions and buy certificates, and then a marketplace sort of works out. So what are we combining here? We're sort of combining the idea of a marketplace with a quantity control, and it kind of, in the end, forces us or creates a price for a carbon emission that is not set exogenously by the government figuring out how high to tax something, but it's figured out by the market. So we have a marketplace, and we get the reduction, and so that should lead to the cheapest reduction to be implemented. Kind of sort of what we had with Susanna's idea about the cook stove. Which are a really cheap way of reducing carbon emissions, and then that should be sort of picked. And so Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement establishes the sort of idea of carbon credits, and the really big idea here is the one that says a company could reduce emissions in one country, not apply the certificates to that country, but bank them, receive a credit, and then sell those credits to a company in another country, where that company can then use those offsets, those carbon credits. That would sort of be the magic that Article 6.4 would then establish. And that would then really lower the cost of an emission reduction. Here's a big slide, and you don't really need any much of the detail here. This is how the cost of lowering emissions, the cost per ton of carbon emissions. And you see on the very left side of the graph, you see something that goes in the negative. These are basically projects that every single firm should do. They're positive NPV. For example, switching out incandescent lighting bulbs to LED light bulbs. It's a little bit of a cash cost, but it has huge savings going forward. It's a positive NPV project. You should do it. It increases firm value. Now, absent regulation, absent sort of any external push, no company should do these other things, because they're negative NPV projects. Yes, they may save some money, but not as much as they cost early on. Now, when we think about this sort of being the cost structure, and we as a government force a 15% reduction, and we force that 15% reduction in emissions everywhere, that means 15% of every single bar will be forced upon the economy. That's going to be really costly, because we're going to force 15% of the most costly way to reduce emissions, as well as forcing 15% of sort of a very cheap way. If we think about capping the overall and letting a market trade and having people paid to do the cheap emissions reductions, well, then a 15% reduction is approximately free. This is just me sort of eyeballing the chart. So I sort of drew a box that sort of roughly is 15%. And as you can see, that should roughly be at zero cost, because we're going to have some that are positive NPV, some that are slightly negative NPV, and that should sort of work out. So the idea of adding these cheap projects to lower emissions is really an idea of achieving the same amount of emission reduction, but achieving it cheaper. Or to say, we spend the same amount of money, but we get more of a reduction, or some sort of a combination of two. So now take these United States modular abatement cost curve and add to that Susanna's idea of other countries that potentially have really, really, really efficient projects. And now we're sort of adding them to the mix and then allowing trade across borders. And that should open a lot more ability to do very efficient reductions and lower the overall cost of the carbon dioxide, of the emissions reduction. Good. So now let's say I'm a company, and I'm a company that goes even one step further, that's capturing and sequestering carbon dioxide. So if we look into the cost curve, that is very, very much to the right. That is really, really a really, really expensive way of lowering emissions, especially at the current technologies. If I do that, I don't really have a natural revenue, right? My revenue would be a government that hires me and pays me to capture, sequester carbon dioxide to achieve its national goals. It would be companies that could hire me for them to feel better or to look better, whatever sort of their ambition is here. Or it could be a regulatory certificate. If we have a cap and trade system, if we have a market, I could sort of produce these certificates and then get paid by selling the certificates. So again, sort of having this sort of regulatory marketplace in here. If we have such a marketplace, just like Susanna said, we will need a regulatory body that certifies, that creates rules and specifies how to earn those certificates. And that's sort of the beginning of, that's sort of the idea of the intent of Article 6.4. And that's sort of where all of this will have to be hashed out to get to an independent auditor who then validates and verifies the compliance here. So now let's take a look at the firms. How would we deal with the accounting for the credits? If you sort of think about these credits for my carbon capture and sequestering firm, we have these credits that provide an incentive to me, right? I, as a manager of the firm, I tend to be interested in bonuses based on earnings. I tend to be interested in the price. Stock prices react to earnings. So somehow there has to be a way for the credits to hit earnings. So how do they hit earnings? It could be, we could think of this as similar to a product. I have a cost to creating a certificate, and I have a future revenue from selling it, should hit my balance sheet as sort of some sort of an asset. It could be similar to holding materials. Again, some sort of an asset. This is an asset that will reduce the cash cost of a future sale. Or it could be similar to advertising. It's sort of a cost that improves, the brand value if I'm just sort of planning on using it to show the market that I'm net zero, for example. So two of these, holding a product, holding materials, we would capitalize it in an inventory. An advertisement expense that would sort of just be an expense that directly hits the income statement. If we look into the accounting rules, it's everything is a little murky. We don't really have good guidance right now at this point. We know that the IASB has put something in the reserve list on the project on pollutant pricing. Reserve list means if we have time, if we don't spend our time talking about other rule changes, then we'll put it in. So this is not likely to be discussed before 2026. The FASB actually issued a proposed accounting standard on pollutant pricing mechanisms. They're currently open for comment letters. So this is sort of something that is in the process, and they're trying to work out how to deal with sort of regulatory certificates. We have new IFRS standards. There's one part in here that requires firms to disclose information about the use of voluntary carbon credits. This is, again, in the not regulated side. This is involuntary stuff that Susanna was talking about. And here, sort of the standard setter is trying to figure out what the firm actually intends to do with it, because that matters. So if we think about the US car manufacturers, and we have the EV like Tesla, Rivian, and Lucid, those are heavy sellers of regulatory certificates. You may wonder what kind of certificates. We don't have a cap and trade system like this. We have national CAFE standards, average emissions of the car fleet, as well as ZEV, the zero emissions vehicle standards in California. So here we have car manufacturers that produce electric vehicles. They need some of these certificates when they sell a car, but they produce extra certificates whenever they produce and sell a car. So basically, there's at no incremental cost, they create this sort of extra asset to them that they can sell later. This does not enter the balance sheet. And when it's sold, that revenue is recognized under automotive sales. So we can sort of think of this as a product that they produce, but at zero cost. It's kept in the balance sheet at zero cost. And when they sell it, they actually generate a revenue. And then that is sort of part of their core business. If we look at the traditional car manufacturers, GM, Ford, Stellantis, Chrysler, and Dodge, and Ram, and whatever, those are net buyers of these credits. So they produce a few by producing hybrid vehicles or EVs, but they use way more in all of their gas-powered cars. And so they are basically buying up these credits and then using them. So when they buy them and not use them, they hold them in the balance sheet as a prepaid expense, similar to Tesla, Rivian, and Lucid, but here at a cost, not at zero cost. And then they include it in COGS or SG&A. Under the very rare instances that they actually sell some, which happens, it's just not very often, this is recognized as other income. This is sort of not part of their core business. This sort of just happens when they see a lucrative opportunity arising. If you wonder about a company like Toyota that is started out as a traditional, but is moving more and more into the electric market, they are moving. They started out as a net buyer, and they are much more frequently now selling. So currently it's still listed as other income, but the bigger part of a company this is going to be, the more likely they're sort of going to have to dedicate it as a core business revenue later on. Now, when something like this happens, we see that companies have an incentive to change. They may have an incentive to start in producing certificates, or at least have an incentive to reduce emissions, or need fewer carbon credits, need fewer certificates. If we look into Tesla, for example, in the fiscal year that just ended, they generated almost $3 billion, $2.76 billion from regulatory certificates, these CAFE and ZEV certificates. And again, this comes at close to zero incremental cost. But it's not like that they need to do a whole lot. They may have a software, they may have to hire a person to sort of track them, but they don't really have to do anything, and they generate these certificates and make really a lot of revenues from them. If we look at the net income from last year, that was $8.4 billion. So if we hold the certificates at zero cost, that's about a third of their income comes from certificates. If we think about their lifetime, that was $11.4 billion in certificates revenue. Without those revenues, Tesla would at least not be what it currently is. So we can really see how a standard like this provides incentives to firms to do something, to change something, reduce emissions, and sort of spur innovation. This does not come without risk. We know that voluntary carbon markets suffered hugely from exaggeration, from projects that were not legitimate projects, projects that weren't additional projects. We see offsets when we buy an airline ticket. We see an offsets being offered that is just too cheap to be true. What works? We know what works. Standardization, verification, enforcement, all of those works. The FDA exists because there were scandals. Pretty much every single FDA rule exists because there was some scandal that needed to be addressed. Now, once we bring a regulator in, we know that there's a risk and we know it's not going to work, right? A regulator will decide what is acceptable and how much one technology counts, which means there's a regulator that picks winners and losers. Whenever there is a situation like this, we're going to have corporate lobbying, and some of that lobbying will be successful. There will be inefficiencies. Firms will focus on a most profitable way to create certificates, not on the most efficient way to create those to create certificates. So what we really need here is some balance, right? If we have rules that are too harsh, that restrict the availability of credits, then that's going to restrict the impact. If we have rules that are too lax, it's going to undermine credibility, and it's going to add sort of a whole bunch of inefficient projects. If we take a step back and we look at it more broadly, we know every time we do a regulation, there's going to be some distortion. Some of that distortion is intended. If we increase the price of carbon, there's going to be less use of carbon. That is sort of the intended. Some of the distortion is not intended. If we believe managers care about their firm's stock prices, values, they will have an incentive to make good choices, and they will have an incentive to pretend to have made good choices. If we create standards on carbon credits with cross-border trade, if we create sort of that opportunity, there's going to be misclassification, and standards will help reducing that misclassification. However, as Susanna said, it's going to allow firms to sort of pick the cheapest project, and that's going to potentially create a shift to sort of go to the cheapest possible way to get a certificate, and again, maybe not the most efficient certificate. What it all really comes back to, in my mind, is the fact that regulation happens in very predictable ways. If we look at accounting regulation, we know it's really, really old. It's a very well and fine-tuned system between availability and reliability of information. We ask firms to provide information, but we also know that they misreport. Despite the 100 years of maturity here, the fine-tuning, all of the effort that we do, misreporting still happens. We cannot get rid of misreporting. As long as people care, there's going to be misreporting. So as long as stakeholders care about how green firms are going to misrepresent and pretend to be more green than they are. I personally wouldn't worry too much about greenwashing. I would worry too much when there's no more greenwashing, because no greenwashing means nobody cares. If we shift the climate and we shift sort of the political system and we want firms to not look green, then we're going to have firms that report that they are not green or don't talk about how green they are. As far as research goes, we've seen exactly that. When we ask firms to disclose more, we're going to have more misreporting. Europe is just adopting the CSRD, so Climate and Sustainability Reporting Directive, and firms will have to report over 1,100 metrics. It's absolutely certain that we're going to have accounting scandals, but that doesn't mean that anything is wrong. It just means that people care, and it means that people are using the information. So that's sort of a good sign of regulation. All right, so this is it of me, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna and Mirko, for these great presentations. We're going to start out with me asking each of you a few questions, and then we're going to turn to the audience Q&A. So my first question is for Susanna. Hearing you present your data, the data seem frankly incontrovertible. It seems really clear that it is preferable and cheaper to avoid emissions by subsidizing better cook stoves than it would be to subsidize EVs or some of the other types of emissions avoidance technologies on the right-hand side of Mirko's abatement cost curve. So why is this so hard? Why is this so hard? Where's the disagreement? Why is this so controversial?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So a nice feature of being an academic is that my paycheck does not depend on what I find, which is not the case for many companies. Certainly a project developer themselves, their paycheck directly depends on how many carbon credits that project is able to issue. So it's totally understandable. The project developer themselves has every incentive to overclaim how many emissions reductions their project achieved. And so ideally what we would have is we would have an independent set of evaluators who, like academics, truly don't care about the outcome. And actually, if anything, care that the outcome is correct. Like I do genuinely care that we reduce emissions, right? And so I want to identify high quality products. And so I think setting up that type of auditing structure is really difficult. I think it's similar to when you think about like Moody's or S&P, when banks want their rating to be good, it becomes really difficult to find a way to ensure that all of the ratings are, completely independent and completely rigorous. And so that type of question, how do you ensure that the audit process is completely independent and completely, separated from, payouts or financial incentives? That's, it's not just carbon offsets that faces that problem. It's a lot of different industries that find that problem. But I think if we solve that, then it is actually quite straightforward to evaluate different projects, measure their actual reductions, and then make sure that those are the ones that get sold on international offset markets.
Great. Thank you. So my next question is for Mirko. Mirko, in the United States at least, and frankly, a little bit in the EU as well, in the last few weeks, there has been some retrenchment in public law and regulation with respect to environment and climate. And that may be a huge understatement with respect to the United States. That may be a moderate understatement with respect to the EU, which recently indicated that the CSRD, the major sustainability reporting directive, is going to cover fewer companies because it's going to have sort of a higher employment revenue threshold for companies that are covered. How do these shifts in the regulatory environment affect any of what you described? So you described a universe in which Tesla and Rivian and others generate these revenue through the sale of the carbon credits. Toyota is shifting from a purchaser to potentially being a seller. How does the sort of recent regulatory environment shift potentially play out in this space?
I think that there's a lot of things going on, as you said, really a lot of things going on right now. I think we can separate a little bit. So what we see, the shift here with the CSRD, I say here because I'm in Munich right now, but the shift that we see here right now is a shift in reporting. This is truly in reporting. This is firms complaining that the CSRD is too onerous, that it's too expensive to follow through. And so then, the sort of limitation was we're not imposing these big extra costs on 50,000 firms. We're just going to impose it on whatever 20,000 firms. So it's just the bigger firms that sort of can afford this extra reporting. That's sort of one thing. I would say the other part that we see, the sort of the political shift that we see in the US right now, this is going to lead to uncertainty. So if I'm a company and I'm trying to make an investment in producing certificates, regulatory certificates, one thing that is really important is that I have the certainty that these certificates are actually going to be in use a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, when I reap the benefits of making my investment. If I worry that the rules are no longer in place, or that they're watered down and not really biting anymore, and that the revenues from these certificates, from these credits, reduce because the rules just aren't stringent enough anymore, well, then I may just not make that investment right now. And I think that's sort of what we see in generally in the market, is that firms right now tend to sort of hold their breath a little bit and trying to figure out what is actually going to happen, what part is going to stay, what is not going to stay. And that sort of creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is not good for investment. I think that's sort of the biggest piece that we see right now.
Great. So my next question is for Susanna. I think it's really interesting that you proposed a Food and Drug Administration for offsets. So my background and training are in legal scholarship, and it's interesting because the FDA in the United States takes a much more precautionary approach. Before something can go on the market, we need to ensure that it's safe. That's not necessarily the case with how all regulatory agencies in the United States approach questions, right? There are other, for example, toxic chemicals in the United States, which can be put on the market, and only if they're demonstrated to be unsafe can they be taken off the market. So I'm sympathetic to your FDA for the carbon credit market. My question for you is kind of related a little bit to the question for Mirko about sort of the current political environment. How do you think that, or do you think that there is currently any political appetite to create a government entity to perform this task? Do you think that a private sector entity could fill the gap in the absence of sufficient political will? In one of your earliest slides, you mentioned the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is a non-governmental organization that certifies net zero commitments by firms. Would something like that be sufficient, or do you think it's extremely important that it be a government entity? So I've sort of thrown a few questions, but hopefully they're all related.
Yeah, so there's certainly, I think, no need for the entity to be government. There's no strict requirement that it be a government initiative. It just needs to be fully independent. Same with Moody's and the like. I think the example of the FDA, I think it's just nice because it shows that it's not impossible to have a competitive industry, capitalist industry, with a lot of oversight as well, where, there's limits on what you can sell in the market. This is not unheard of. And so for carbon offsets, when we talk about we need to set up a massive infrastructure for certifying projects, that infrastructure will be expensive. I just think it's worth emphasizing that it's totally possible. And many industries work in this way, that there is a large system for verification and monitoring and authorization that is supporting that kind of market equilibrium. I do think that there is appetite for markets just because it, as Mirko emphasized as well, it reduces costs, right? If we can find a way to do this rigorously, then some of the most expensive ways to reduce CO2 is, for example, my understanding of the technologies that are out there, things like aviation fuel, right? So flying, if you actually wanted to make that cleaner, it would be incredibly expensive to do so. You can actually reduce way more CO2 if we can establish a rigorous method for allowing airlines to instead offset that through offsets. And so I think especially companies that have very high costs, that do care about reducing their environmental footprint and would like to make progress towards reducing it, but just realize that doing it within their own companies, something like airlines, they may realize that doing that within their own companies is just economically a really inefficient way to do that. And so I think there's certainly appetite for reducing costs and expenditures on climate. And so I think improving the quality of this market helps do that.
Great. So we're beginning to get some questions from the audience, and I'm going to work those into the moderated Q&A. So one of the questions is, could a ledger using blockchain reduce the chance of accounting scandals since results are visible to all users and cheaters will be called out? I'm going to guess that maybe that's for Mirko first. So maybe Mirko, you want to jump in, and Susanna, if you have
No, very clearly. I mean, this is something that's been discussed in accounting. I think what we see is a hesitancy to change rules. Again, it's an equilibrium that has developed slowly, and similar to the FDA, it's an equilibrium here. The disclosure regulation, the measurement and disclosure, is an equilibrium that's developed slowly along scandals. We see firms doing something that they shouldn't be doing, but getting away with it up to a point where they don't get away with it anymore. And then it all sort of breaks down. When it's the FDA, people die. That certainly has helped sort of establishing a strong, independent agency on that side. When it's accounting misreporting, then firms go bankrupt or people start losing money. That has also helped in sort of creating a strong regulator here. I think blockchain is one of the ideas that could really help, because we see the past transactions and could disclose them. But I do believe that there's just big hesitancy in changing anything. We have a system that sort of works and is pretty good at limiting big scandals. And I think there's just fear of changing too much at a single time and then losing control all of a sudden.
The shortcoming of blockchain, of course, is at what point does it enter the blockchain system, right? So if you talk about people using charcoal stoves in Kenya, there's a process of, at some point, that person, that individual, that single individual using an improved stove, that has to be entered into the system at some point. And so that process before that, so, at an extreme, you could have monitors in the stoves. Actually, for example, induction stoves could have this. It's actually straightforward, technologically speaking. You could measure how much is the induction stove actually being used. How much does that mean less gas is being used, for example. But that actually doesn't even fully solve the problem, because additionality requires knowing, was this person going to buy an induction stove anyway? In which case the subsidy didn't do anything. It just gave them a little bit of money. And so actually knowing, did they buy the induction stove because of the subsidy or just they were going to anyway? So even if you could perfectly enter the data into blockchain at the point of starting, even then you wouldn't be able to perfectly identify additionality. So I think there's a lot that needs to happen offline before you can enter it into the blockchain ledger.
Great. Wonderful. Okay, so we are now getting a few additional questions. We just got a question. Thank you very much for these fantastic presentations. In addition to carbon credits, do you know about anything on biodiversity credits? If so, are you able to speak to how they might be similar to or very different from carbon credits?
So I can speak a little bit to that, and I think there's something really unique about carbon dioxide in that if you emit it in the US or you emit it in Kenya or you emit it in Thailand, it has almost exactly the same impact on climate change. And so somebody who lives in any of those countries should care equally about a ton of CO2 emitted in the US versus a ton of CO2 emitted in Thailand. And that's not the case with biodiversity. It is to a certain extent, right? People in the US value the existence of biodiversity in other places, but there's a lot more local benefits from biodiversity in your community, in your region. So I think there you could look at state governments or federal governments across the world for what are their local benefits to biodiversity, and then factoring that into their decision making. Certainly within the US that happens. So I think to a large extent that problem is much more local one. Of course, not completely, because folks, in the US, for example, might care deeply about the existence of biodiversity and the preservation of biodiversity in other countries. So to that extent, it is worth having that type of offset market, if you will. But I think there is this kind of uniqueness to CO2 and just how uniform it is globally.
And we have more established rules on that side, right? We have the Paris Agreement. We have nationally determined contributions where countries sort of pledge how much they're going to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. We don't have the similarity on the biodiversity. We don't sort of have the sort of, as you said, the sort of global thinking of me valuing your biodiversity and vice versa. So I think that the closest approximation would be we have a local, let's say, airport extension that is going to cut down, it's going to reduce some wetlands. And then the airport makes a deal with the EPA or whatever local administration and says, yeah, I'm going to get rid of these wetlands, but I'm going to do this other project that enhances biodiversity close by, not right here where I want to build the airport, but close by. And then we sort of have these local deals almost with the local regulators to sort of get back, but it's not a credit that I can then sell.
And I think biodiversity is also just a really complicated word, right? A ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2. You have a credit for a ton of CO2, whereas biodiversity, there's very subjective different opinions about how you would value different types of species. That's an incredibly complicated conversation. It's really important, but it just makes it harder to have a commodity market, basically, where commodity markets, the product has to be identical.
Great. And I would note that there is some overlap between, biodiversity and carbon emissions, right? So maintaining a forest, preventing deforestation can also preserve habitat, can, generate local benefits in terms of filtration of air and reduction in local air pollutants. So these two can be overlapping and have these kind of co-benefits. All right, we're getting a flood of questions. So the next question is to ask for your read on the carbon or accounting benefits from regenerative agriculture, which is arguably one of the perhaps lower hanging fruit, well toward the left on the accounting chart. Any particular thoughts on regenerative ag?
I have not looked into this. That is interesting. I mean, from an accounting side, it would change the way that it would change the value of the asset. But I have not looked into this. That's interesting. I want to put that on my list of things to look into. It's a long list, arguably. But
yeah, absolutely. Susanna, any thoughts on regenerative agriculture?
So I'll make a broader point, which is that I firmly believe that there are many other opportunities like offsets that can reduce emissions at really low cost. It's totally possible that regenerative agriculture is one of those opportunities. I think there's lots of other opportunities, but until there is very rigorous evidence generated by independent evaluators who have no financial incentive for a certain set of results, it becomes really difficult to identify which project is or isn't, actually living up to the promise. So if that evidence exists, that's great. If it doesn't exist, I think that's the priority for any of these potential promising projects, is to generate that independent evidence.
Great. All right. So I'm going to build on that question a little bit with a more general point, which is that largely today we've been talking about reducing emissions, right? So an EV potentially it goes to zero, but maybe actually is just lower emissions depending upon where you're plugging it into the grid. An efficient charcoal cook stove is a reduction in emissions. So one of the reasons why the topic of carbon offsets and carbon credits has been controversial is about concerns, additionality, verifiability. But a different concern relates to whether carbon offsets or credits should be permitted based on the mere reduction of emissions as compared to the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And I wanted to give each of you the opportunity to address that question, right? Should we be thinking about carbon credit markets, carbon offset markets really as, we want them to move toward removal? Are we satisfied with mere reductions? How does your research sort of intersect with that issue?
I mean, I'll go back to what I said earlier, which is that a ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2. And if you go from emitting 7 to emitting 6, or you go from 0 to -1, in both cases, you are reducing 1 ton of CO2, and that has exactly the same impact on climate change. So in terms of the methodology will be very different.
Right.
How can you measure these things and verify these things? Sure, there will be very different methodologies, but in the end, we should value a ton of CO2 at a ton of CO2. I think a related point to this is, you're never going to get to zero global emissions purely on offsets or purely on reductions. But of course, we're not aiming for that this year. Right. So all of this is a dynamic over the next 50 years. What is the path that we should take? Certainly, I would hope that, in 5 or 10 years, there won't be that many charcoal cook stoves. Right. And then we should switch. So I think the process is more, what should we do this year and the year after and the year after? And we should start with the cheapest things. And then at some point, the emissions reductions will be so low, or the emissions will be so low that then you want to go to removals for what's left. And so it's certainly going to be a very dynamic path.
I always prefer simplicity. I like Susanna's, a ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2. That is simple. I think ultimately that is why taxes work so well, because we are sort of getting away from the small definitions, the how, the this, the that. Is just a ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2, and we can that works, and that is simple. Now the benefit of the offset market, the carbon credits market, would be you can have a regulator that adjusts over time. We could say at the beginning a ton is a ton, and we can say as we move along the line, if we need to put an emphasis on removal, then we can call a ton of removal a ton, and we can call a ton of reduction 0.9. So you can adjust, right? Like, it's not like we make a decision now and that has to be set forever. That is similar to how a regulator picks winners and losers and says, here's a technology, here's a type of thing that we want to emphasize, that we want to sort of focus on. So if that is the will, then that can certainly be the will. But I like simplicity. I think that is good as a general rule.
Great. So we've gotten a few questions about kind of the role of finance and funding. One along the lines of, Professor Heinle mentions that taxes are a no-go, but is there research demonstrating other ways to fund these climate mitigation efforts? We've received another question related to impact ESG investment funds and sort of private investment. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to the role of private investment in this space to promote climate mitigation.
I mean, a really big hope and from a research side, an unanswered question is that on whether investors have a taste to be willing to forego some returns for the money to have a good use. There's certainly a lot of results in the literature right now that suggest that is the case. So we have a famous study on German twin bonds. So the German government issues bonds, one that has a green use, and then a twin bond that is of general use. So it's not a green use, but otherwise is identical in financial terms. And it looks a lot like investors are willing to pay more for the green one than for the not green one, even though issuer is the same, solvency is the same, interest rates and the term structure and everything is the same. If that is the case, then we totally have an alternative pathway. It doesn't mean that it's going to solve all problems. But if investors are willing to forego returns by having the money to be put to good use, then there's totally an alternative. The more disclosure and regulation and standardization we can have on that, the more trust will be in the market, and the more these types of investors will sort of use that market. But that would be an alternative. The other alternative is indirectly taxes. So we have governments coming together, deciding to spend money. We all kind of know that that money that they're spending has to be raised by taxes, but they don't talk about taxes when they talk about spending. And that sort of works a little better in the public field, apparently, where we're very happy to hear that the government is spending money. And then we kind of ignore that they're going to raise that money to spend it. So it seems to be working better.
I'll push back a little bit on Mirko saying taxes are a no-go. A lot of countries have carbon taxes. From like Canada, the EU, Chile, Argentina, South Africa, Japan, like a lot of, even if it's not, 100% of the economy, every ton of CO2 is taxed. It's often certain industries that are taxed, or the power industry, often heavy machinery, heavy industry. A lot of countries have carbon taxes. And one good reason, actually a great reason for this, is that if you want to, as a government, you want to keep your revenue the same. If you add a carbon tax, which actually has positive benefits for the world, you're reducing CO2, you can now lower income taxes, or you can lower sales taxes. And all economists agree that, we don't like sales taxes, we don't like income taxes. They distort with economic activity. So it's actually, I think a lot of countries are realizing that if you add a carbon tax, you can actually lower your other taxes. That's one alternative. And then I'll briefly say, I know people always talk about raising a lot more money, but just the importance of spending it wisely, right? You can raise $100 billion, and if you spend it 10 times less effectively than $10 billion, then actually they have the exact same impact. And so I think there's been just in global conversations, there's so much focus on certain financial targets, spending targets, and not enough talk about spending that money in the most effective way possible.
Great. I'm going to ask for a kind of lightning round response to the last set of questions, which have to do with economies outside the United States. Briefly, what do you think are the best ways to incentivize other large emitting countries like China or India to reduce their emissions? And will the programs that you've been advocating still allow for developing countries to emit CO2 as they develop? Lightning round.
So China already has an emissions trading scheme nationwide, right? So China already, for a long time, and most other large countries have at least as stringent, if not more stringent, climate rules than the US. And second, a lot of Chinese emissions are from goods that are sold to American buyers. So when we count China emits a lot of that is producing the goods that the US is then consuming. So thinking about who should be responsible for financing those emissions reductions, I think makes it very complicated. I think we certainly also, for example, should reduce a lot of emissions in India, but certainly not funded by Indian citizens, who are some of the lowest income and the most vulnerable to climate change, right? Most climate change has been caused, most of the CO2 that is currently in the air has not been caused by places like India. And so you can have a conversation about who should be responsible for financing it there, but those international flows should get to India because there are very cost-effective ways of reducing emissions there.
Constant communication and commitment. If we do stuff ourselves, that's the best way of sort of getting other people to join in. If I don't even do stuff myself, I have a really hard time getting work out of other people. It's really hard.
Wonderful. Well, with that, we thank you so much for this discussion, and I'm going to turn it back over to Robin to conclude our session.
Thank you so much, Sarah, Susanna, and Mirko, for leading today's session. That was really fascinating information that you shared. And thank you to all of our alumni for joining us today as well. The session has been recorded and will be available on our video library page in the coming days. We hope that you enjoyed today's webinar. An email with information about how to get involved with ESG at Wharton, along with our webinar feedback survey, will be sent to you later today. We hope you'll join us for our next webinar on Wednesday, April 9th, Entrepreneurship, Wharton Style, with Professor Lori Rosenkopf, Vice Dean of Entrepreneurship and Professor of Management. Thank you again for joining.